You're watching Retro Myrtle Beach Guy, brought to you by Spinstead and Ederpt Productions, a Spinstead and Ederpt company. Now here's your host, Retro.
Alright, and we are back. Retro Myrtle Beach Guy, and we're talking retro realism. Might not be the best way to start off a video about realism, right? So I'm sure you've noticed that everyone's jumping on the retro bandwagon. I'm sure you've all seen how retro fashion, retro style, all this stuff is taking over the internet.
Rain bonnets were kept on your purse and held this, which protected your hair from the rain.
How much have you seen of me, cinematically?
Germany, Japan, Russia, China. Everyone's enjoying recapping the 20th century's best styles. Retro style, retro clothes, retro hair, retro makeup. Retro cars, retro homes. And it seems like everyone's looking back for style and fashion inspiration these days. Yes, whether it's Victorian, 70s, 60s, 50s. So something you might be noticing is so many of these people who are into retro, vintage, all that kind of stuff, they're young. This isn't people going, oh, I miss the 60s. I want the 60s back. I'm gonna start dressing like it's the 60s. These are people who weren't even conceived, whose parents might not have been conceived in the 60s. A lot of these are Zoomers, millennials, obviously. And I'm sure there's something to be said with, the current state of things, that maybe people don't want to think too much about modern times, and to look back at more nostalgic times when things were, easier and simpler, as they're often portrayed. And retro realism is something that I touched on in our retro home tour here. What makes it so easy to have nostalgia for these time periods that we ourselves did not experience is that we didn't experience them. Most of these things we experienced through media, movies, TV shows, fashion magazines, stuff like that. So this perfect idealized 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. I'm sure y'all have seen this meme where it's what people think the 80s looked like versus what actual growing up in the 80s looked like. And that's not a phenomenon specific to the 80s. I'm sure there's been times in the past when you've looked in your family photo albums and been like, why was my family so unfashionable during this time period? You look at Elvis and Dolly Parton and all of them and Marilyn Monroe and you're like, how come my grandma looked like this? Because the thing is that most people weren't Elvis or Dolly Parton or all of that. They were regular average folks wearing the kind of comfortable clothes that made their lives easy. And this isn't just if you watch time period, specific media. There's a weird little phenomenon with movies, TV shows, especially with movies though, especially with action movies, really cool movies. So really what it comes down to is marketing, commercialism, like most things that you experience in your day-to-day life, right? It comes down to the fact that Denny's doesn't want to be associated with gun-wielding, thieves bent on, murder and destruction. So Pulp Fiction takes place at the Hawthorne Grill instead of a Denny's. You see what I'm saying? So that's why all these epic scenes that we've seen in movies from our youth and teenage years, all that stuff, they generally take place in retro establishments. They're driving vintage cars. Do you know why they do that? Because car companies don't want to be associated with criminals and shootouts, and heaven forbid the car crashes. They really don't want you to see what it looks like when their car crashes. So a lot of people have to rely on vintage cars for all these scenes. You ever notice how often you see like an 87 Volvo in movies? Because it's old enough that they don't care if, there's associations with an old Volvo. They don't want you driving old Volvos. They want you driving new Volvos. You starting to get it? That's why Quentin Tarantino doesn't have a guy in a Guess Jeans t-shirt or a polo shirt shooting up establishments and, hunting down people or whatever. They're wearing a Hawaiian shirt. Have you realized how often the protagonist in action movies is wearing a Hawaiian shirt? It's because they're nondescript. No one can be like, oh, that's the kind of person that wears those kinds of clothes. I better not buy those kinds of clothes. Because there isn't a brand that is going to be associated with it. There's not a brand that's going to get mad at you because you made one of the characters shooting up an establishment. He's wearing, a polo or, Nike or whatever. Brands don't want to be associated with this stuff. So a lot of wardrobe departments, a lot of prop departments rely on vintage clothing, vintage cars. It's also a phenomenon where poor people have really nice classic cars and live in gorgeous mid-century houses. And that's, again, to portray that they're, working class or poor people. People making movies, they don't they don't know. They're just like, I don't know, they're poor, so we'll give them a 76 Gran Torino to a 16-year-old because they can only afford a Gran Torino.
That cost $112?
110. Keep the change.
Axel in the middle. Come on. I couldn't afford a Gran Torino. But this is what happens. It's all about what they want to portray. And they portray winning good people as driving new cars.
Make a right turn.
You watch your The Office. They're all driving new Hondas, new Volkswagens. They're nice people. Brands want to be associated with stuff like that. You watch Kramer. Brands don't want to be associated with that. He's driving an old Lincoln, So this is how it happens. And then this is why people of our generation who have these deep associations with this media associate things that are vintage with being cool. Again, think about all the times you've seen a guy dressed like this in a movie. He usually has a gun on him somewhere. So that's the reality of the situation. It's marketing. It's them wanting to be able to sell commercials and stuff and merchandising. That's it. So the same thing goes with, clothing. A lot of times people are modeling vintage clothing after what they see in movies and what they see on TV. And again, you got to remember, if you're watching I Dream of Jeannie, those clothes were furnished by designers who wanted you to see their clothes on TV. If you're watching Modern Family, those people are wearing clothes that are furnished to them by designers because they want you to see their clothes on TV. Your grandfather went to Sears to buy what he called slacks and, pipe tobacco. And that's where most of their fashion came from. It was just, well, this is what's available in our town. It wasn't like before. You could have endless supply of whatever you wanted. You had to go to a department store to buy designer clothes. And most people, Sears, Woolworths, Montgomery Ward, that's JCPenney's, that's where you bought your clothes. I think this is Penny's, actually. So the associations are drama, action, comedy, cool, vintage. And that's why so many people of this generation have these associations. It's not as deep as you would think. I mean, you could say that they grew up after 9/11 and that the world's pretty much been in chaos for the last 20 years and there's nothing about the modern world that anyone would really want to... But I think it's really more marketing than anything. Marketing, commercialism, it's a heavy part of it. Because again, we all grew up, the zany, wacky character on Seinfeld, Kramer, vintage clothes. Pulp Fiction, the cool guy, Robin the Diner, vintage clothes. Romeo and Juliet, awesome custom guns and cars, vintage Hawaiian shirts every single time. It's not because guys that dress like this are particularly cool. I will admit that. I am not particularly cool. But if you saw me in a Quentin Tarantino movie, you'd be like, that guy's got a gun. Right? So yeah, I mean, personally, with my house, with my clothes, I always try to dig through vintage pictures, specifically regional. So I love pictures of Myrtle Beach, pictures of men about my age in Myrtle Beach, 50s, 60s, 70s, and what they were wearing. I find countless examples of this in the Facebook groups, even at the Horry County Museum, right over in Conway. They got whole rooms full of pictures of stuff of just average Joes going about their lives. One of the main things that you'll notice in this time period, especially with men, is the lack of patterns. Plain white shirt, plain yellow shirt, plain blue shirt. The slacks have no pattern, just the most clean fabric you've ever seen, straight line, pleats, all that stuff. It's much more simple. And again, they're average working folks, And I'll say that recreating that style day to day, it's a lot easier for a guy than it might be for girls socially, because I can leave the house looking like this. I can walk downtown looking like this. Casual wear for women in the 50s and 60s, I know we all like to think they all look like Marilyn Monroe, but casual wear was like a muumuu, a house dress, sometimes a paper dress, curlers in your hair, sometimes whatever, the plastic sack or whatever they'd wear over their curlers. Think back, man, if you remember, that's what your grandma looked like. That's what your aunts looked like back in the day. Something like, it'd be great to see stuff like that come back too. I would love to see more muumuus, more house dresses in the vintage scene, man. More retro realism would be awesome. Now again, I fully respect the people who do the high-end retro fashion, cosplay stuff. I think it's amazing. I don't have that kind of dedication, and I like to be comfortable. So casual is generally how I go, and you'll find that it's more this kind of stuff. But the funny thing is now people are just kind of homing in. You'll have like a 19-year-old who's like 1920s. I want to look like I'm in the 1920s, and they will morning to night, dress gown, the whole thing, do the 1920s bag. And I think that's super cool. It's a totally new thing. It might just be that after COVID and all the gym wear that we're just at the end of fashion, that there's no new fashion coming out. You've seen what they have coming out in the runways. Right? Like, no one's ever gonna actually wear that stuff, ever. So, but yeah, the boldness of some of these people doing their own thing, honing in on a time period and really punching it out, man. There's some friends I have on Instagram who do like 80s looks, and it's, again, They weren't born. These kids were probably born in like 2003. They don't know anything about the 80s, but they look at it and they're like, man, that looks so fun. And it's because for them, that's the TV that they were watching because their parents were watching. Are you figuring it out yet? When I was coming up, my parents were watching I Dream of Jeannie, Bewitched, Batman, The Munsters, all that stuff. Is that any wonder that I thought that cool people dressed like Jack Tripper? I get it. But yeah, that's the rub. It's incredibly popular with young people right now to start looking back for all these fashion inspirations and stuff like that. And I just think it's really cool of them because I myself, I've always been into this kind of stuff. When I started seeing other young people, getting involved and just really dedicating themselves to it, that's when I was like, okay, man, like something's happening here. Retro's taking over the world. So until next time.
Stay positive, and that's how you do it.
Another gem from Myrtle Beach and Spinestead and Ederpt.